Last week, the disciples in John's gospel were huddled together behind locked doors, afraid to leave the house. This week, Luke's gospel tells a different story. Two disciples on the road to Emmaus. But a better title would be The Road Out of Jerusalem. Cleopas and a friend are getting out of the city where Jesus was arrested, beaten, and crucified. We don't know where they are going, and maybe they don't know either. They're just getting away from the situation, getting away from the possibility of more violence, getting away from the possibility of deeper hurt. I mentioned last week that fight or flight wiring that governs our normal responses to fear. How I've noticed that the fight response seems to be on the uptick in the world around us and maybe inside some of us as well. But today's gospel story is more about the flight response, which is probably the more common one for most of us. Despite the vast differences between John's gospel and Luke's gospel, both seem to be dealing with fear. Deep fear about what could happen if the disciples live into the way that Jesus taught them, the call that he issued to them. Fear is what keeps them from living the way that Jesus lived, living the way they want to live, living the way that Jesus promised would bring the world and them peace and joy. Fear is so often the thing that holds us back. Sometimes that fear is healthy. It's what keeps you from getting too close to an abusive person or from walking home by yourself late at night in an area where crime has happened before, or what helps you set boundaries that are good and reasonable. Yet often that same protective instinct is what keeps us from taking the risks that we need to take and that we actually want to take to live the lives that we've been called to live. We live with this kind of fear every single day. I know I do. Something as simple as the fear of making that difficult phone call. The fear of going to that event where you're not going to know anybody. The fear of having a meeting with that public official that you know you have significant disagreements with that need to be named and clarified. The fear of visiting somebody in the hospital and saying the wrong thing. The fear before standing before all of you on a Sunday morning and saying something that sounds stupid, uninformed, or not good enough. The fear response in all of these situations is designed to protect me from not getting hurt. And there are a million ways to get hurt. If I make that phone call, that person might tell me that I've disappointed them in my actions or my efforts. If I go to that event, I might leave feeling more insecure and alone than when I first arrived. If I take on that public official, I might be even more disliked than I already am, or I might get punished for telling someone the truth in a system that rewards loyalty more than honesty. If I flop in the sermon, someone might criticize me even more than if I just kept my thoughts to myself. It's the fear that holds me back. It's the fear that holds any of us back from doing what we've been called to do, living the way we've been called to live, risking the way we want to risk, to live the lives that we want to live in the world. Now, psychology has helped a lot of us with parts of this kind of fear, whether through medication or therapy, meditation or mindfulness. Countless numbers of people have been able to put their fear back into perspective where it belongs. You shouldn't be held hostage by your fear. It should be working for you. And I'm so glad that we've developed ways of helping people get the fear response back into the proportions that they're intended to be, protecting us instead of hurting us even more, signaling us instead of driving us. There is help for that kind of fear. There's no need to deny yourself that kind of healing if you want it. But psychology has its limits when it comes to the kind of fear that the disciples are dealing with. Fear that is right-sized and based on what could actually happen. The disciples could actually face the same gruesome death as Jesus. The disciples could actually face whippings and beatings at the hands of the Romans. The disciples could actually face the end of their lives on their own crosses. And while psychology could give disciples the resources to respond to that kind of fear in an informed way, no amount of psychological training could rid them of the reasons for the fear itself. This calling could lead them to imprisonment. This calling could lead them to their abuse. This calling could lead them to their deaths. Thinking differently about that fear isn't going to save them from any of those potential outcomes. Fortunately for them and for us, God gives us something even more powerful: resurrection. As Frederick Buechner once said, resurrection means the worst thing in the world isn't the last thing. The last thing is the best thing. And talk about ending fear. Imagine if you could actually believe that the worst thing that could happen to you or someone you love could never be the last thing. Imagine if you could believe that whatever terrible events might come your way in your life, including your own death, that still could not be the last thing. That's the impact of Jesus' resurrection on those two disciples running away from Jerusalem. Death doesn't have the last word. It's the penultimate thing, not the ultimate thing. There is life beyond Jesus' death. There is life beyond this worst ending. There is life beyond their most dashed hopes. If you believe in resurrection, then fear has got nothing on you. You can face any struggle, any threat, any worry with the confidence that life will always be found on the other side. You can take on any assignment, however daunting, however grand, with the confidence that life will always be found on the other side. You can face down any mean spirits with a dignity and a confidence that is frightening to the opposition. You can be free in your spirit before full freedom ever comes. That's one main gift of a resurrection faith. If you are able to believe it, then death itself, the thing that we fear the most, has nothing on you. Weeping may linger for the night, the psalmist writes, but joy comes in the morning. The worst thing is never the last thing. But there's another gift that resurrection faith gives to the disciples and to us. Resurrection means Jesus is still with them. On that road where those two disciples are nursing their grief and running away from the lives they want, Jesus meets them behind the locked doors of their fear. Jesus finds them in all of their doubt, uncertainty about their own competence and capability. God is alive and well and with them every step of the way. Every step of the way. That doesn't mean, by the way, that God is out there causing all this bad stuff to happen so that resurrection faith can shine through. I wouldn't even say that God is allowing all of it to happen. That's focusing on the wrong thing. Our kind are the ones pulling the triggers in the streets and in the schools. Our kind are the ones voting people into office who use trans kids as the scapegoats to distract us from dealing with the big divides between the haves and the have-nots. Our kind are the ones who are disenfranchising black voters and refusing to even open the door about conversations about repairing the harm that hundreds of years of racial animus, segregation, and policy have enacted on people of color, including people native to the lands we are worshiping on today. All of that is on us and our kind, not God. But God is with those who step into that fear to participate in struggling to bring more justice to the streets and the suites. God is with those who are working hard to bring good news to the poor. God is with those who are weeping with those who weep and mourn right now. That's the gift of resurrection faith. A with us God who is in the business of bringing life out of death, the very thing that gives rise to fear itself. Last Sunday marked the 60th anniversary of Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail. And I've heard Taylor Branch say before that we should consider this document as a founding document for the country. Dr. King does a number of important things in that document, but one of the things that he does, from jail no less, is to focus on the courage that God demands from all Americans, but especially from the church. Human progress never rolls in on the wheels of inevitability, he wrote. It comes through the tireless efforts and persistent work of people willing to be co-workers with God. And without this hard work, time itself becomes an ally of the forces of social stagnation. A few years ago, Ta-Nehisi Coates in Between the World and Me took issue with the way we tell the American story of racial redemption. Almost always on the backs of the suffering bodies of black people. The enslaved were not bricks in your road, and their lives were not chapters in your redemption history, he wrote. They were people turned to fuel for the American machine. I think he was saying we should never glorify this kind of suffering. We should only glorify the courage that is needed to get through the suffering to the justice held hostage on the other side. Yet even Coates himself, I love this, even Coates himself, an atheist, can only account for the courage of those social justice warriors of our history who take on injustice with abandon, can only account for it by their faith. I think they are fastened to their God, he writes, a God whom I cannot know and in whom I do not believe. But God or not, the armor is all over them, and it is real. It's resurrection armor, friends. God's gifted it to you and to me to put on every day, to make those hard phone calls, to make those new connections across every prohibited line, to stand up to public officials when we need to stand before others and speak your piece, to step into the calling that God has planted deep in your heart to be a part of the healing and the justice making and the chapter writing work of changing the world. Resurrection armor, to step into the places of real danger, which are usually the places of real opportunity, unafraid of anything, even death itself. Resurrection armor. Put it on and take off the fear. Put it on and take off the worry. Put it on and do what God has called you to do. Be who God has called you to be.